Hola a todos, hola a todas, ¿cómo están? Espero que muy bien. Estamos nuevamente en un episodio de las charlas COVID. Creemos que ya es el número 26, 25, por ahí estamos. Ha sido toda una experiencia de aprendizaje y desde luego estamos muy agradecidos de toda la gente que ha participado y que nos ha dado su perspectiva sobre inicialmente cómo comienza este confinamiento y luego su perspectiva sobre cómo lo enfrentamos, cómo volvemos a esta nueva normalidad. Hoy día, junto a Ezequiel Passeron de la ONG Faro Digital y junto a Raquel Miño, profesora de la Universidad de Barcelona, tenemos el honor de conversar con una de las voces más representativas de la educación, ¿no? Más relevante de la educación, sobre todo en el marco de la sociedad digital, como es Neil Selwyn. Bueno, será una charla de aproximadamente unos 30 minutos donde conoceremos un poco su perspectiva sobre cómo afrontamos el desconfinamiento, sobre todo en el contexto educativo. Así que yo ahora comenzaré a hacer la conferencia junto a mis compañeros en inglés. Probablemente todos podrán después consultar esta entrevista con los subtítulos que ofrece YouTube en castellano. Y de todas maneras, si no, estaremos a vuestra disposición en las redes sociales. ¿Vale? Okay, Neil, how are you? How are you
Bueno.
live the lockdown? How you live the lockdown there in Australia?
I think Australia has had a very easy lockdown. So it's a combination of geography. We're a long, long, long way away and we're very spread out. And also we have a government that the government did not respond very well to the last disaster, which was the bushfires. They got criticised a lot for not doing anything. And this time around, I think they were super, super keen to be seen to be acting in the best interests of the public. So far, the government have been actually really good, which I would not normally say. So we've been very lucky so far, but we're bracing ourselves for the second wave. But I mean, compared to Spain, we're very, very lucky.
There is a 9-hour time difference between us. Thank you very much for accepting be part of this discussion. I would like to know how the Australian population live the lockdown, and especially the educational system. You know, because you have the challenge also to return to classes, for example. So, how was this process live?
Well, I'm not Australian, so I could actually say from an outsiding perspective, I think Australians they like authority and they do conform to authority. So people have followed the regulations and the rules. And so the lockdown period was different from state to state. So there's 8 different states and territories in Australia, and they've all been completely different. So I live in one of the more populous states, Victoria, with Melbourne, and also New South Wales. And those states actually had school shutdowns completely for the last 6 or 7 weeks, and they've gone back. But in the Northern Territories, which is really, really remote and rural, they didn't shut down the schools at all because of equity. You couldn't shut the schools down. There's lots of indigenous populations there, very little digital technology. So their schools stayed open. So it's been different from state to state, but people have obeyed the regulations. And I think the last cohorts of students go back on Tuesday. So at Tuesday, we're all back to school.
Good. Raquel, I don't know if you would start.
Yeah, it looks like the situation is quite different in Australia than in Spain. And we want to talk a little bit about the future of public education, if you'd like to start from this broad point, because there's a lot of voices, a lot of conversations about public health systems at this moment in many countries and parts of the world. But I don't know if we're having enough conversations and discussions about what kind of education system do we want, and do you think this is an opportunity for us to stop and think about what kind of education system we want, and how can we rethink this public education system?
Yeah, it's interesting. Back in the UK, where I'm originally from, everyone was coming out on Thursday evenings and clapping for making applause for the health workers, for the National Health Service. No one was doing it for the teachers, which was interesting. And I think it's not post-pandemic because we're still in the middle of the pandemic, but we are at a very precarious point. And so I think people are having conversations about rethinking education. It's interesting you use the word opportunity, because you can see a lot of the private big tech corporations using the word opportunity, or Sal Khan was talking about the silver lining of this might be a tip over to blended. Stephen Heppel talks about the genie being out of the bottle. So there's a lot of enthusiasm amongst people about using technology to flip the education system over for good. And I think that's a threat. That's not an opportunity. I think dark forces are gathering, wanting to use the pandemic as an excuse or a justification. And we can see this. I mean, I don't know if you've been following New York City, for example, sorry, New York State. So you've got big dollars and quite a weak public education system. And so people like Governor Cuomo are talking about flipping over and a new normal and blended education. And he's brought in the Gates Foundation and Eric Schmidt and a whole bunch of people to reimagine New York schools. And I think we need to fight this. And in some ways, the pandemic, I think, should have signaled the death of techno-solutionism. So this idea that technology can solve huge problems just hasn't happened. The COVID tracing apps that were meant to have not worked at all. We have to wait for a vaccine, and we have to wait for slow science to take place. So by now we should have realized that technology is not going to solve problems. And so education is the same. So I think we should fight these sort of conversations that we need to flip schools over. But it could also be an opportunity to reimagine public education. I mean, Australia at the moment, because parents have been involved in homeschooling for the past 6 weeks, the population is more engaged than ever in the education debate, because everyone has been a teacher. Everybody can see what teachers do. And so I think parents are quite sympathetic, they're quite grateful, and it could be time for a proper debate about what we need to do. I think parents understand what the great bits are of schools, and they also understand what the crappy bits are, particularly in terms of ed tech. And governments have actually done some quite interesting things. We have quite a right-wing government in Australia, but they cancelled the standardized testing for the year, the NAPLAN test. And these have been hugely controversial for the past 10, 15 years. This year, they cancelled them. That sets a great precedent. This year, governments were buying laptops and giving free Wi-Fi connectivity for low socioeconomic households. Again, that's a great precedent that's been set. And I think we can push for things, educators need to get involved in these conversations and say, hang on a minute, things are not the same. Which way do we go?
Yeah, Neil, we agree that just by talking in these conversations we are having with educational referents of all over the world, that there's great vindication of schools or of education and in the public sense. So, but what we also see is that this pandemic forced us to an emergency education that increase a little bit more the segregation we have in the educational system. How can we fight against amplifying this segregation and the difference we have between different parts of population?
Yeah, no, you're right. It has been an emergency. And so we should be using words like this. I was reading this morning, the Education Endowment Foundation in the UK are calculating that the pandemic, the couple of months that they've had of non-schooling, has pushed back equity issues in terms of attainment by 10 years. So we're going to see gaps emerging. It's a real concern. So I was looking at the figures last week about parental surveys, and the parents who are least enthusiastic about sending their children back to schools are those from the lower socioeconomic groups. So this idea of there being disconnects between families and schools and students and schools has widened. As soon as you've taken students out of schools, it's the middle class that want to get their kids back quickly for free childcare so they can get on with working. So I think there is a concern there. The best education systems I'm seeing and the best schools are planning compensatory programs during the summer. So extra classes, extra school for kids who have missed out. And the second thing I would really interested to see happen is for better planning for next time. I don't think this is the last time we're going to have school shutdowns. We're already seeing individual schools shutting down for a second time. As soon as there's a bit of an outbreak of the virus within the local community, we have to go back to remote schooling. The first time around, you're right, it was an emergency. We were kind of caught unawares. Everybody actually pulled together and did a very good job at very short notice. But if we're going to have to do this again later on in the year, or even next year, we should plan properly and make sure that we are going to compensate for students who are maybe struggling, How do we put on compensatory programs, have support for parents and support for teachers, and have better wraparounds, and just be prepared. So I think there are plenty of things we can do better next time. And I would say it upsets me, but I'm not surprised. Private schools, independent schools in Australia have done much, much better. They're better resourced, the teachers are more up to speed. It would be great if those schools could reach out to public schools and give them advice, give them support, give them resources, all of these things. So if it happens again, we can't complain that we weren't prepared.
Right.
Raquel, or me?
Well, yeah, I will go back, if you allow me, to your first idea of the dark forces. I liked it very much. So how do you think we can face this dark forces as critical educators, especially to promote learning and well-being? Because without well-being, I think it's so difficult to learn. So how can you think we can face these dark forces with a critical perspective?
Well, it's interesting because I think you can have these conversations now. So as critical educators and critical researchers, we've been researching these issues for decades, the digital divide, the whole affective and emotional aspect of teaching. You can have these conversations now with people. You can talk to head teachers and policymakers about inequality of digital access, and now they'll agree with you. Whereas 6 months ago, they would have said, oh, everyone's online, it's not a problem. You can talk to people about issues such as online mental health, emotional stress, the whole draining nature of online education, and people understand because they've been in Zoom meetings for 5 hours a day and they feel frazzled. So I think we can have these conversations that we're prepared to, that we know about and we've known about for a long, long time. And in some ways, all the dark forces are just accelerating lots of pre-existing logics. I don't think there's anything new that we're not prepared for. So what's being pushed now is personalized learning, datafication, surveillance pedagogy, automation, and it's for the same reasons, cost savings and efficiencies and outsourcing. So I think it's time for critical education researchers to actually raise their voices and say, well, you know, we have something to contribute here, and we need to attack the notion of blended learning as somehow a positive thing and a neutral thing. We need to attack the idea of flexibility and push back. And we also need to attack the idea of individualization and personalization. These are all things that we have evidence, and policymakers are looking for evidence, they're looking for guidance. And I think we should be in a fairly strong position. So it's, in some ways, the time has come. This is why we've been doing all this research. And if we don't speak up now, then why have we been doing this research?
Okay, but there are a lot of enthusiasm in some technological industry about this new possibility to work in this new ecosystem. What do you think that the school can face this phenomenon in the future? Because there are, for example, there is a large technological industry that are thinking that the possibility to continue or to promote with the classes in bimodal or on an unimodal learning environment, on hybrid learning environment. What do you think about this in, for example, secondary school or in university school?
I'm not anti-technology at all, and I think technologies can be really useful. And in fact, it's interesting to think where students have actually benefited from the shutdown. So, you know, students who were perhaps school refusers or were not enjoying school or actually probably had a good time. But on the flip side, I think it is at least necessary for us to raise awkward questions. I don't think primary schools are going to tip over to blended learning anytime soon for a whole bunch of reasons, resourcing, and just the nature of primary schools being, as I say, childcare and also socialization. Secondary schools, I think there is more of a tendency to flip over to blended forms of, and in some cases that might be a good thing. I was talking before about the very rural and regional areas of Australia. Well, they already do use blended learning approaches. If they want to learn an advanced Asian language, and there isn't an Asian language teacher in the school, then the kids already do online lessons. I think where the real change will be with higher education. I mean, most of us work in universities. Our university in Australia, we're teaching online for the rest of the year. I know that in the UK and US, they'll be teaching for the next 12 months online. And I think the tip over will be there. I think education, universities may well go much, much more online. And I'm not sure whether I think that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think the universities in some ways are a bit of a lost cause. But public schools and secondary schools I would want to fight for, because it's in terms of the life chances of the students that go there, I think it's really, really important to fight for face-to-face, local schooling, learning in the community. And I think parents, teachers and students are actually in a very good frame of mind at the moment to fight for that as well. I mean, I mentioned last week in the Australian press here that there might be a return to some form of remote schooling, and everyone was appalled. They were, oh, really? This is terrible news. We can't face it. So I think people are ready to actually push back. I think the blended tip will actually be in universities, and that's a whole different argument than it is for schools. I think people are very positive about schools at the moment, so we should capitalize on that and have blended learning where it works. And there are some technologies which are fantastic. There are some which I think we should be skeptical about.
Ezequiel?
Right. Neil, I heard you talking a little bit from the question of Raquel about the critical perspective. Do you think that most of teachers, especially of schools, right? I'm not talking of universities. Do you think they have the formation in order to be critical with digital technologies, or do we have to work a little bit more hard there?
I mean, teachers are not stupid, and I hate to come across as a kind of critical researcher that somehow thinks they have all the answers and everyone's can't see. You know, I think teachers are very aware of the limitations of technology, but they are so busy and so time poor that they have no time or energy to fight a battle against technology. They have 101 other battles to fight: standardized testing, you know, even fighting for their own jobs and for not having their wages cut. So technology comes very low down the priority list. And it is seen to be kind of a neutral thing that doesn't really matter. It's just seen to be in the background. So one of the things I would like to do is just to politicize some of the technologies that are now in schools. I know that the Education International Union, for example, have been fighting against Pearson and some of the automations, automated essay grading, and this whole idea of the automation of the classroom, personalized learning systems. I think we just need to, it's not a question of kind of getting people to recognize it. I think they recognize it, but getting people to recognize how serious it is. That although it might seem like a background problem, it's actually a foreground problem and is reflective of a whole bunch of wider issues as well. And I think people are actually coming that way anyway. And in some ways, there's been a societal backlash against technology, you know, this tech clash against big tech. You know, Cambridge Analytica, the NSA revelation. So people are actually fairly skeptical about technology. What I'm finding recently is people are actually too skeptical and just want to get rid of all technology. And I don't think we should get rid of all technology. That's crazy. So in some ways, I'm standing up a bit saying, hang on a minute, tech can be good. But so I think the time is right. And as I say, this is the time that critical education, technology, and the conversations we've all been having for the past 10 years have come to the fore. So I think it's a conversation. I don't think I have all the answers, and nor do you. But we can contribute our voices and make people see it as a problem and it's problematic.
Yeah, I love when you say the word politics and just being aware of that when we educate, we are doing politics, and I think that it's a very interesting approach in order to understand the importance and the relevance of maintaining and sustaining public education. I think that this is one of the big lessons I think that the pandemic gave us, and I also agree that debating and just talking and just building sense or construct positions with these talks. We were also listening a lot to the podcast you are doing. I think that in order to discuss and to argue about these things and just to try to construct knowledge in a collaborative way, it's one of the most important things in these times that we are living, right?
Exactly. And I think even just getting people seeing technology as something which is contestable, which can be otherwise, something that you might disagree about or argue about or struggle. So even just simple terms in terms of procurement, why would you use Zoom as opposed to Microsoft Teams? Why would you use Microsoft Teams as opposed to an open source version, which is non-proprietary? So even little things like that, that's politics with a small p. But these things are really important because it unpacks conversations about the data economy, big tech as opposed to small tech. I would love to be using a non-proprietary video conferencing suite for this interview, but I've tried them out for my own teaching and they were all crap. They didn't work properly. Zoom actually works really well. So it's really complicated. I know there are problems with Zoom, but it's so just having these conversations about procurement, about what should be online, what should be offline, all these things are really, really important.
In the same way, I would like to know your opinion about the Zoom, the phenomenon of Zoom. Why Zoom is increasing in these last 2 months? What, especially in the school?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big company that was always there in the background. Actually, my university has used it for a few years, and we have a Zoom license, so I wasn't surprised. But it kind of came out of left field for everybody else. And what was interesting actually was that as soon as Singapore, for example, and I think it was New York as well, began looking at Zoom's privacy policy and its data policy, people began to withdraw. And it was quite interesting that there was a conversation about, oh my God, the data from Zoom, what does Zoom do? And they had a very, very fuzzy kind of attitude towards data privacy and data protection. And the company actually came out and admitted it and said, we'd never actually thought about this before. And it got conversations going. So even though it became very, very popular, it's interesting to see how people have pivoted away. But unfortunately, they're pivoted towards Microsoft Teams or Google Hangouts or the usual. There'll always be a big tech company waiting to kind of increase its shareholding. And it was lovely for Zoom to make their product free for schools. I say free in scare quotes. But yeah, I'm also interested as well in the whole phenomena of replicating teaching. So people wanted to go to Zoom because they could replicate live teaching and live lectures. Even just having a conversation about asynchronous teaching as opposed to synchronous teaching, I think is a conversation that we need to have. Doing things differently, not just trying to replicate the same old things. So yeah, I don't own shares, but if I did have shares, I wish I had shares in Zoom because we'd all be millionaires.
Raquel?
Well, if we have time for a couple of questions more, I'd like what you said before, that the time has come to rethink, to discuss, to think about how do we want to think to change some things in education, not only in schools or university, but in the whole education system, which is also families and media. And maybe I would ask about what would you add? What is lacking in educational spaces? What kind of literacies or competences or content do you think it's lacking in educational context? And what would you add? For example, you talk about learning analytics. In a course I've been teaching, we talk about fake news, for example, how we are not ready to maybe address, identify fake news, but not only kids, it's also old people, adults. So what kind of contents and literacies and content would you add to education?
Oh man, that's a huge question. But I mean, one of the things I was trying to argue about before was with teaching, for example. Teachers were not trained to teach remote schooling. They're not even trained to teach virtual schooling. So the idea of actually kind of giving teachers sustained professional learning opportunities to teach in this way, I think is really, really important. And a lot of the literacies, I think, or teacher competencies that have come out over the pandemic, it's not technical literacies. Turning Zoom on and making sure it works is one thing, but it's highlighted all the other kind of soft literacies that you need when you're teaching and learning with technology. So the idea of digital empathy, for example, actually having a kind of a deep awareness and consideration for the students. When you teach online, the setting of the class is not the same as the face-to-face classroom. It's 30 different homes, 30 different bedrooms, 30 different contexts. And just having some kind of empathy for the multi-sited nature of the teaching and learning is really, really difficult. Thinking about the affective and the emotional strain and the stress of actually learning online is a really important thing. And also having a digital restraint, not using technology, having the confidence to say, we're not going to do this online, or we're not going to do it synchronously. We can use paper, or we can do whatever. I think those are all literacies which have come out now. Teachers don't get taught those in their teacher education because it's not seen to be important, but now it is. The data thing is interesting. Data is clearly a big push in education, in higher education, and it's trickling down to schools. And so my interest in learning analytics and data, is more thinking, like I said before, about how could data be used otherwise. It's not just used for metrics and performance and accountability. I'm quite interested in this whole idea of alternative data, alternate data, getting students and teachers to generate their own alternate data sources that tell different stories, messing things up, using data for surveillance as opposed to surveillance. And there's some really interesting theoretical paths which we're trying to explore in schools. I love the data feminism book that's just come out by Catherine Dignaglio and Lauren Klein. The idea about data for social justice, data for care, data for empathy. We don't have to use the same analytics and dashboards and data tools that we're given. We can think otherwise. We can make our own. We can use them for bottom-up resistant activities. Those sorts of things are fascinating.
Oh, those are great suggestions.
Sorry, no, Raquel,
I just wanted to say thank you because these are very good suggestions. I'll already start reading about data feminism and data for care. Very, very good idea.
Yeah.
Last two short question, okay, Neil?
Go for it.
Okay. Since this COVID crisis, in which area do you think that the emphasis should be on design the next public policy for digital inclusion? I am thinking this question because we can imagine that the 2030 objective have been lost, right? I don't know if you think this is not our focus now.
In terms of having a policy conversation, I think it's really, really important that we try to document and try to work out what's happened. People are scrabbling around. Before the first wave died down, governments were really desperate to know what's going to happen. What does the research tell us? What evidence is it? And the answer is there's no evidence because this has never happened before. But I think if we can properly document and research and find out what the effect of all this has been, my hunch is that the first top line answer is going to be social inequality, digital inequality. And then once we've documented that, then we can have a serious conversation, evidence-based conversation about what needs to be done. So clearly there are massive inequalities in terms of basic levels of access, functional access, and what the Pew Research Foundation called the homework gap. And I think we can have some serious conversations about the really important role that libraries and other kind of non-formal education institutions play in keeping digital learning afloat. That was a big problem. A lot of kids rely on libraries or McDonald's even for the Wi-Fi to do their homework. The idea of there's a whole bunch of stuff, but I think if we actually stop and try and document what's happened, that would be half the battle. My worry is that we haven't got time to do that. Teachers are so busy and trying to get on with the next phase. Academic researchers are all in a spin. I think there should be proper funding for proper kind of evaluation of the social and the economic and the cultural effects of the lockdown. For all, not just for schools, but for kind of home life, for domestic violence. There's a whole bunch of things which we need to make sense of. And from an Australian perspective, I talked at the very beginning about the bushfires. This isn't the last time there's going to be an emergency and schools are going to shut down. There's a whole bunch of climate-based emergencies. There's a whole bunch of all sorts of things. So I think this is going to be, unfortunately, a more regular occurrence in our lifetime and the lifetime of our children. So we need to get used to it. We're not going to be living in a stable world, and school education and digital education is not a given. So if the pandemic has taught us one thing, it's we shouldn't take anything for granted.
Yeah, Neil, I hear you talking about massive inequalities and not living in a stable world, and I'm just thinking about US and all the news we are seeing. I don't know, just to close this interview before saying thank you for your time, I would like to know some thoughts about what you are seeing. We are all informing ourselves with social media especially, and there's a lot of information. And if you have some link between education and or maybe how by our educational system, and how about facing all these problems and struggles that now we are seeing in US, but I think that in the whole world, we are having these inequalities, and how can we face them by or with education?
No, you're right. I mean, I was having a conversation yesterday about UNESCO's learning cities and the whole concept of a learning city. Well, what's a learning city when you're in Detroit or Minneapolis or any other city at the moment if the city is dysfunctional? But you have to have hope, I guess, and you have to hope that education is one of the cornerstones that we can gather around. And I think what worries me about the way the technology's gone in the past 25 years, 30 years, is this hyper individualization that we both revel in, but is also our downfall as well. And I think things like public schooling are a place where people can get together and think communally and act collectively. And so if education can be somewhere where we actually find some similarities and find some kind of obligation to each other, then face-to-face schooling will have a really important role to play in kind of healing a lot of the problems that technology's wrought. And of course, you can use technology to come together as well. But I think technology without face-to-face in education does lead to all the problems about fake news and disintegration and people just living in filter bubbles. So that's why I'm hopeful for schools. I mean, schools are not perfect places. Schools can be horrible places for some people. I'm not saying that schooling, it's golden age of schooling, but it's got to be better than not having schools. And so if we can just work hard and remind ourselves about why it's nice to come together face-to-face as well as it is online, then hopefully we can have some hope about a society. There we are. That was a good kind of positive note to end on, wasn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
Well, Neil, so thank you very much for your time. It was really, really nice to talk to you. It's always very enlightening, but today with this mix of hopeful and also critical perspective that we need so much at this time. So I just can say thank you, and thank you for your time.
Oh, it's nice to see you all again.
Thank you, Neil.
Thank you, Neil. Bye-bye. See you.
Gracias.